Millionaire arrives home early, finds stepmother kicking his daughter. What he does leaves all stunned ears. The quiet streets of Austin, Texas, looked ordinary that Thursday evening, but behind the tall iron gates of the Carter mansion, a storm was about to erupt. When wealthy businessman Jonathan Carter decided to come home earlier than usual, he expected to surprise his daughter with dinner. Instead, what he saw in his living room shook him to his very core. His own stepmother, the woman he trusted as family, raising her hand against the child he loved most. What Jonathan did next left the entire household, and later the whole community, absolutely stunned. Before we dive deeper into this shocking story, let me pause for a second. If you love powerful, real-life inspired stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode from Story Globe. And if this story stirs something in your heart, give it a like. It helps us bring you more stories that matter. Jonathan Carter was known as one of the most successful men in Austin, a self-made millionaire, admired in the tech industry, and respected for his business sense. To the outside world, Jonathan's life looked perfect, but behind the gates of his mansion, there was a reality few people knew. Jonathan's greatest treasure wasn't his wealth, it was his 8-year-old daughter, Emily. After losing his wife years earlier, Emily became the center of his world. Every decision Jonathan made, from how late he worked to where he invested his money, was tied to the thought of giving Emily a better life. Jonathan often said, "I can rebuild money if I lose it, but I can't rebuild a child's heart if it's broken." That was the kind of father he was: protective, gentle, and deeply invested in his little girl. But the woman who should have been another guardian in Emily's life, Jonathan's stepmother, Evelyn, saw things differently. Where Jonathan saw innocence, Evelyn saw inconvenience. Where Jonathan gave love, Evelyn gave cruelty. On the day everything changed, Jonathan returned home earlier than expected. He thought he would surprise Emily with her favorite dinner. Instead, he walked in on a scene that froze him in his tracks. There was Evelyn, not speaking in correction, not guiding with care, but shouting at Emily with venom in her voice. And then, as if words weren't enough, Evelyn lifted her foot and kicked the child who was barely half her size. Emily curled up on the floor, too frightened to even cry loudly. Jonathan stood in the doorway, his heart pounding. For a moment, he could not believe what he was seeing. This was the woman who once claimed to be part of his family, now treating his daughter like an enemy. He wanted to rush forward, to stop it immediately, but something inside told him to wait, to see, to listen, to understand how far this had gone. Because in that moment, Jonathan realized this wasn't the first time Emily had been treated this way, and that realization changed everything. Jonathan Carter was not born into wealth. He grew up in a small home, raised by parents who believed in hard work and honesty. His father, Richard Carter, was a stern man who provided for his family, but often carried a cold distance. His mother, Margaret, on the other hand, was warmth itself. She taught Jonathan patience, kindness, and the importance of protecting those weaker than you. When Margaret passed away, Jonathan was only 21. The loss cut deeply, leaving both him and his father broken in different ways. Richard sought comfort in remarriage, and that's when Evelyn entered the family. At first, Jonathan tried to accept her. She was polished, elegant, and carried herself with authority. But there was something beneath her smile that unsettled him. Evelyn's attention was always more on appearances than on people. She wanted to be seen as the woman who brought class into the Carter family, not as someone who truly cared for them. Over the years, Jonathan noticed how Evelyn subtly undermined him, dismissing his ideas, criticizing his choices, and making small, sharp remarks when his father wasn't around. Still, he endured it for one reason: his father loved her, or at least thought he did. Jonathan stayed quiet out of respect. But Evelyn's bitterness grew when Jonathan succeeded. His company flourished, his name gained respect, and suddenly the stepson she once looked down on was the one everyone admired. That shift made her colder. Then came Emily. From the moment Evelyn laid eyes on Jonathan's daughter, her disapproval was clear. She would say things like, "Children are meant to be disciplined, not pampered," or "Your daughter is getting spoiled." But Jonathan disagreed. He believed discipline should come from love, not cruelty. He believed children needed to feel safe in order to grow strong. Evelyn never understood that. To her, Emily was a reminder that Jonathan had built a life of his own, one that didn't revolve around her or Richard, and so resentment began to poison her heart. That day, when Jonathan saw Evelyn kicking Emily, every instinct told him to run to his daughter and throw Evelyn out. But he knew one thing. Anger could make matters worse. If he reacted in the heat of the moment, Evelyn would twist the story. She would claim he exaggerated, or that Emily was misbehaving. Without proof, Jonathan feared his own father might side with her as he often had before. So instead of shouting, Jonathan made a decision that required even greater strength. He stepped back silently, pulled out his phone and began recording. Every cruel word, every action, every moment of abuse, he captured it all. Because this time, he wasn't going to let Evelyn escape the truth. And as he watched, his heart broke at the sight of Emily's silence. The little girl didn't even call out for her father. She simply curled tighter, as if this kind of treatment had become familiar. That realization cut Jonathan deeper than any insult ever could. At that moment, Jonathan wasn't just a father protecting his child. He became a man preparing to expose a secret that had been hidden for far too long. Jonathan stood frozen, his phone still recording, every muscle in his body tight with anger he was forcing himself to control. Then he stepped forward, his voice steady but sharp. "That's enough." Evelyn jerked around, startled. For a second she faltered, but quickly pulled herself together. "Jonathan, this isn't what it looks like," she said quickly, smoothing her tone as though she hadn't just raised her foot against his daughter. Jonathan's eyes never left Emily. His little girl sat on the floor, curled up, her tiny shoulders trembling. He crouched down, opening his arms. "Emily, sweetheart, come here." The hesitation that followed broke him inside. Emily's wide, fearful eyes flickered between her father and Evelyn, as if she wasn't sure whom it was safe to trust. That hesitation alone told Jonathan more than words ever could. She had been living with this cruelty for longer than he realized. Finally, Emily inched forward and he scooped her into his arms. Her body shook against his chest, and she whispered the words that cut deeper than any wound. "Daddy, I'm sorry." Jonathan closed his eyes, fighting back the ache in his throat. Sorry. His daughter thought she was the one who needed forgiveness. That was the damage Evelyn had done. He looked up, his voice low but firm. "You kicked my daughter. You called her names. And you think I don't know what's been happening in this house. Evelyn, you crossed a line you can never come back from." Evelyn straightened, her voice sharp. "Don't be dramatic. Children need discipline. You've spoiled her since the day she was born. She needs correction." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his grip on Emily protective. "Correction is not cruelty. Discipline is not abuse. You don't teach respect by humiliating a child. You break them. And I won't let you break Emily." Evelyn smirked, though her eyes flickered nervously. "Your father would never believe you. He knows me. He trusts me." Jonathan raised his phone with one tap. Evelyn's own voice filled the room, every cruel insult, every bitter word, even the sound of the kick she had tried to justify. Her face turned pale. For once she had no script to hide behind. Jonathan lowered the phone, his words slow and deliberate. "This house will never again be a place where my daughter feels fear. Not while I'm alive." Emily clung to him tighter, her little arms wrapped around his neck, finally feeling the safety she had been starved of. Evelyn stood frozen, her pride fighting against the reality that she had been caught. But Jonathan knew this moment was only the beginning. The real battle was just ahead, one that would not only expose Evelyn, but also test the strength of his family, his values, and his love for his daughter. Evelyn tried to steady herself, folding her arms as though she could reclaim control of the moment. Her voice rose, sharp, and defensive. You think a short video proves anything? Children exaggerate. Emily's spoiled. Jonathan, you've made her. I was only trying to make her stronger, teach her discipline. That's what real mothers do. Jonathan's eyes hardened. A real mother protects. A real mother nurtures. A real mother doesn't make a child apologize for existing. His words were calm, but each one landed like a hammer. Evelyn laughed bitterly. You're blinded by love. You don't see how dangerous it is to raise a child without firmness. One day she'll grow up soft, entitled, unable to face the world. Jonathan shifted Emily slightly in his arms, brushing her hair back from her face. The girl hadn't spoken since her whispered apology, her silence heavier than Evelyn's rant. He kissed the top of her head and answered, not just to Evelyn, but to everyone who might ever excuse cruelty in the name of discipline. Strength doesn't come from fear. Fear builds walls. Strength comes from knowing you're loved, even when you fail. And I won't let anyone teach my daughter that fear is her teacher. Evelyn opened her mouth again, but Jonathan cut her off with something she wasn't expecting: composure. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. Instead, he placed Emily gently on the couch, reassured her with a smile, and picked up the house phone. Within minutes, his lawyer's number was dialed, his voice low and direct as he explained what he had witnessed and what he had recorded. Then he called a family advocate he trusted, someone who had worked with him on community projects for children's welfare. Evelyn's confidence began to slip. She had been expecting rage, a shouting match she could later twist into her own favor. But the calm, calculated steps Jonathan was taking terrified her more than his anger ever could. When he hung up, he looked at her one final time. I don't need to raise my voice, Evelyn. The truth is already louder than anything you can say. Emily's small hand slipped into his. She whispered this time, with a little more courage, Daddy, will she hurt me again? Jonathan bent down, meeting her eyes. No, sweetheart. Not ever again. I promise you that. The weight of those words wasn't just for Emily. It was a declaration for the staff who had quietly witnessed too much, for the father who had chosen not to see, and for Evelyn herself. That night, the first steps were taken to expose what had been hidden, and as the process unfolded, Evelyn's history began to unravel: stories from neighbors, whispers from household staff, subtle signs everyone had ignored. All of it pieced together a picture of a woman who had built her power on intimidation, especially against the most vulnerable.
For Jonathan, it was more than a family matter. It was a wake-up call about silence, how often abuse hides in plain sight, because people choose not to confront it. He knew he had been guilty of that silence too, tolerating Evelyn's coldness for years, out of respect for his father. But now, watching his daughter cling to him, he realized silence had almost cost him Emily's trust, her joy, maybe even her spirit. So he made a vow, not only as a father, but as a man of influence. If I can build companies, I can build a shield for my child. If I can lead employees, I can lead my family out of fear. And if I can stand up to Evelyn, I can stand up for every child who has been told they're weak for being hurt. What happened next stunned not only Evelyn, but the entire community. When Richard Carter finally arrived at the mansion, he walked in with the same air of authority he had carried his whole life. He was a man who had spent decades building a reputation in business, a man who believed he could read people better than anyone. To him, Evelyn had always been a loyal wife, graceful, composed, and supportive. He had never questioned her. That evening, Jonathan didn't waste time with pleasantry. Emily sat close by, still holding her father's hand, while Evelyn stood on the other side of the room, her expression carefully rehearsed into sorrow and offense. Jonathan, Richard began, his voice heavy with irritation. Evelyn tells me you've accused her of something outrageous. She says you misunderstood. You're upset, I understand, but accusing your stepmother of hurting Emily, that's serious. Jonathan didn't flinch. It's more than an accusation, Dad. It's the truth. Evelyn jumped in quickly, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. Richard, you know I would never hurt Emily. I've cared for this house, for this family. Jonathan has always seen me as an outsider, and now he's twisting a simple moment of discipline into abuse. Jonathan turned his phone screen toward them and pressed play. The room filled with Evelyn's voice, her insults, her cruel words, the sound of her foot making contact. Richard's face changed slowly, disbelief, turning into shock. He looked at Evelyn, then at Emily, who lowered her eyes, as though afraid to even watch her grandfather's reaction. Richard, Jonathan said firmly, this is what's been happening when you weren't around. And this is why Emily has been quieter lately. Why she clings to me every time I leave the house. She's been living in fear under your wife's roof. Richard's shoulders stiffened. For the first time in years, he had no ready defense. He looked at Evelyn, and the silence between them said more than words could. Evelyn's face lost its composure. The cracks showed pride slipping into desperation. You don't understand, she snapped, her voice rising. She's a child. Children exaggerate. Jonathan, you've spoiled her so much that now any correction feels like cruelty. Richard, you can't let him turn Emily against me. But Jonathan didn't let her spin the narrative. He looked straight at his father. Dad, this isn't about me. This isn't about whether you love Evelyn or not. This is about Emily. You can ignore me. You can dismiss me. But you cannot ignore what you just heard with your own ears. That is your granddaughter, crying in fear, apologizing for being mistreated. If you defend that, then you're defending abuse. The words landed heavy. Richard sat down, his hand on his forehead, silent. For a man who prided himself on control, the truth had left him shaken. Evelyn tried again, her voice pleading now. Richard, think about everything I've done for this family. Think about how I've stood by your side, how I've Jonathan cut her short. What you've done is break the trust of a child who depended on you. And let me make something very clear. I will not allow you near my daughter again. Not tonight. Not ever. Emily's small fingers tightened around Jonathan's hand. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. But for the first time in days, those tears carried relief. The next calls Jonathan made were not to friends, not to colleagues, but to professionals, his lawyer, the child advocate, and eventually the authorities who specialized in family cases. Evelyn's actions were documented, undeniable, and for once she couldn't escape accountability. Word began to spread, not because Jonathan wanted to shame his family, but because people in the community started asking questions. Staff members who had witnessed Evelyn's temper for years finally spoke up. Neighbors remembered moments when they heard shouted but chose to ignore. Suddenly, the story was no longer just about the Carters. It became about the silence people keep when abuse happens behind closed doors. And Jonathan, instead of hiding the shame, chose to speak openly. People think wealth protects you from these things, he told a local journalist. But abuse isn't about money, it's about power, fear, and silence. And the longer you stay silent, the stronger it grows. My daughter's voice matters more than my reputation, and I will fight for her until my last breath. That statement hit the community like a spark. Parents, teachers, even business leaders began talking differently about discipline, about listening to children, about the difference between guiding a child and breaking one. Evelyn, once admired for her elegance, became a cautionary tale. Her name no longer carried respect, only whispers of cruelty, hidden behind charm. But Jonathan didn't waste his time gloating over her fall. His focus was on Emily, rebuilding her trust, showing her every single day that she never again had to apologize for existing. And in that process, Jonathan did something unexpected. He turned his personal pain into a public mission. He began funding programs for children who had faced abuse, starting a foundation in Emily's name to provide counseling, shelter, and legal aid. What stunned everyone most wasn't just how Jonathan stood up to Evelyn. It was how he turned an ugly private wound into a movement that helped countless families. He proved that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the safety and love we provide for those who depend on. And as for Emily, the little girl who once whispered, "I'm sorry," while trembling in fear, she slowly found her voice again. And that voice, nurtured with patience and love, became stronger than Evelyn's cruelty could ever be. Evelyn was gone from the Carter home within days. The evidence Jonathan gathered, combined with witness testimonies, made it impossible for her to remain. For a woman who once carried herself like the queen of the house, her exit was quiet, stripped of dignity. She left not as a respected matriarch, but but as someone exposed for what she truly was, a woman who chose cruelty when she could have chosen love. Richard Carter, Jonathan's father, faced a storm of his own. For years, he had believed Evelyn's polished words and ignored the subtle signs. Confronted with the truth, he struggled with shame. He sat across from Jonathan one evening, his voice lower than his son had ever heard. "I should have protected you when you were younger," Richard admitted, "and I should have protected Emily now. I thought I was keeping this family together, but I see now, I was letting it rot in silence." Jonathan didn't answer with bitterness. Instead, he looked his father in the eye and said, "Then protect her now. Protect her by standing with me, not with excuses." From that day, Richard changed, slowly but noticeably. He began spending more time with Emily, reading to her, listening to her, letting her laugh without interruption. He was an old man trying to learn new ways, but for Emily, those small gestures meant the world. Jonathan's mansion, once filled with tension, became light. Emily ran through the halls again, her giggles echoing like music. She began to draw, to sing, to ask questions without fear. The scars of fear don't vanish overnight, but with her father's patience and constant reassurance, she was learning to feel safe. But Jonathan's fight didn't stop at his front. He knew too many children were living silent battles, just like Emily. With the help of his lawyer and community leaders, he established the Emily Carter Foundation, a safe space for children experiencing abuse. It provided counseling, legal support, and shelters for kids who needed protection. When the foundation launched, reporters asked him why he chose to make his private struggle so public. Jonathan's answer became a message that spread far beyond Austin. Because silence is the abuser's greatest weapon. If a child is too scared to speak, and the adults around them choose not to see, then abuse thrives. "I will never again let silence be stronger than the truth." That philosophy guided everything the foundation did. Schools began inviting Jonathan to speak. Parents wrote letters thanking him for reminding them that children aren't burdens to be controlled, but lives to be nurtured. Even business leaders admired how he used his success to create change far beyond the boardroom. As for Emily, she grew into her voice. At one of the foundation's first events, the little girl once silenced by fear stood at the podium with her father's hand on her shoulder. Her voice was soft, but steady. "I thought I had to say sorry," she said, "but my daddy told me I never have to say sorry for being loved." The audience fell silent, many with tears in their eyes, because in her small words, Emily had given the most powerful reminder of all. Jonathan didn't just protect his daughter that day when he walked into the living room. He showed the world that protection means action, that love means courage, and that true wealth is not the size of your house, but the safety of the people inside it. And so, when people spoke of Jonathan Carter, they didn't only call him a millionaire. They called him a father who chose love over silence, action over fear. A man whose greatest legacy wasn't his fortune, but the daughter who could now grow up unbroken. And that, dear viewers, is the story of a man who stunned his family, his community, and the world, not with his money, but with his courage. If you've been moved by this story, remember somewhere near you, a child might be suffering in silence. Be the person who notices, be the voice that speaks when others stay quiet. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to Story Globe for more powerful, life-changing stories like this one. Share this video to remind others that no child should ever feel fear inside their own home. Together, we can make these stories lessons, not reality.